All right, welcome. Today we're tackling a really critical topic, India's systemic response to sexual violence. But we're not just going to talk about headlines. This is a deep dive, driven by data. We're going to unpack the official numbers, follow the money, and really explore what the data tells us about the gap. The gap between what's intended by policy and what's actually happening on the ground.
Okay, before we get started, I want you to just look at this number for a second. 31,516. Let that sink in. Because, this isn't just some abstract statistic. Every single number here, it represents a person, a life that has been completely and profoundly changed.
So here's a quick look at where we're headed. We'll start with the raw numbers, then we'll walk through the justice system. After that, we'll look at the solutions, both the courts and the funding, and then dig into a pretty big funding gap. Finally, we'll see what it all means when you put it together.
All right, first up, crime by the numbers. Before we can even talk about solutions, we first have to get a real handle on the sheer scale of the problem we're dealing with.
So remember that number I showed you right at the start? Well, here it is again. In just 1 year, 2022, over 31,000 rape cases were officially registered. And that word, officially, is so important, right? Because we all know that's just the cases that actually make it into the system. It's a staggering volume, an absolute flood of cases hitting the justice system year in and year out. So a case gets registered, what happens next? Well, that's really just the beginning of a very, very long journey. And as we're about to see, it's a journey where a lot of cases, well, they just seem to fall through the cracks. Okay, take a look at this. This chart visualizes what's often called the justice funnel, and you can see why. We start at the top with those 31,516 registered cases. But then, look, only about 26,500 even get to the charge sheet stage. And from there, the number drops again. Just over 18,500 trials were actually completed that year. You can literally see this massive drop-off at every single step. It really shows how many cases get filtered out before there's even a verdict.
So with a bottleneck like that, the obvious question is, what's being done to speed things up? Well, that brings us to the government's main judicial response, creating special courts designed to do just that. And here they are, Fast-Track Special Courts, or FTSCs for short. Their mission is crystal clear: speed up trials for cases of rape and cases involving the POSCO Act, which is the law that protects children from sexual offenses. The whole idea really is to just cut through that massive backlog and get justice delivered faster. Plain and simple.
And let me tell you, this is no small pilot program. We're talking about a massive initiative. Right now, there are 750 of these special courts operating all across the country. So the scale is definitely there. But the big question is, are they working?
This slide tells a story of, well, two sides of the coin, really. On the one hand, look at that number on the left. These courts have cleared almost 290,000 cases. That is huge. It's undeniable progress. But then you look at the other side, and you see there's still a backlog of over 200,000 cases waiting. So what does that tell us? It tells us that, yes, they're working, they're clearing cases, but they are still struggling to keep their heads above water with the sheer volume coming in.
But it's not just about the courts. There's also a huge financial and infrastructural effort happening behind the scenes. And to really get a grip on that, we have to do what they always say: follow the money. And that trail leads us straight to something called the Nirbhaya Fund. So think of the Nirbhaya Fund as the financial engine powering a whole bunch of different women's safety projects. It's not for just one thing. It's a big, central pot of money that's meant to support dozens of different schemes all over the country, all with the goal of making things safer and providing better support. And I mean, the scope here is incredibly broad. We're talking about all sorts of things, like the nationwide emergency hotline, one-stop centers that provide all kinds of help for survivors, and yeah, even funding for those fast-track courts we were just talking about. It also backs big safe city projects and helps set up women help desks in police stations. It's really trying to tackle the problem from a bunch of different angles at once.
But here's a really crucial point. None of these projects exist in a vacuum. Let's take a one-stop center, for example. Part of its job is to provide medical help, right? Well, to do that, it has to connect with India's existing public health system. That whole network from the local clinics to the big city hospitals. So the success of these new projects is totally tied to how well the old, existing systems can support them.
Okay, now we get to the real heart of the money trail. Because, look, it's one thing to have a fund, to have the money approved, but it's a whole other challenge to actually get that money spent on the ground where it's needed. And this right here is where the data shows a pretty massive gap. This chart tells you pretty much everything you need to know. Since the fund started, over 8,800 crore rupees have been greenlit for projects. That's a lot of money. But here's the kicker. Of that amount, over 3,000 crore rupees, more than a third, is just sitting there, unspent. That's a 3,000 crore rupee gap between money that was approved for safety and money that has actually been used. So let's break that down with a few big examples. Take the Safe City projects, massive initiatives in 8 different cities. Well, less than 60% of the money approved for them has actually been used. Or the fast-track courts, only about half of their approved funding has been spent. Now, some projects, like the emergency response system, are doing much better. But for a lot of the really big-ticket items, we see the same story, a huge gap between the budget and the actual spending. Okay, so we've looked at the crime stats, we've looked at the courts, we followed the money. Let's pull it all together. What is the big picture here? What is all of this data really trying to tell us? And here's the key takeaway. The data isn't showing a lack of ideas, right? It's not like there are no policies. We've got the courts, the funds, the programs, all designed to tackle this. What the data is showing is a massive struggle with execution. There's a system in place, it's moving, but it keeps getting bogged down by these huge structural gaps between what a policy says on paper and how it actually gets put into practice. And that leaves us with a really tough question, doesn't it? The plans are there, the money, for the most part, has been allocated. The data shows us clear as day where the gap is between the plan and the reality. So the real challenge now is figuring out what it's going to take to finally bridge that gap. How do we make sure these systems actually deliver the justice and safety they were designed for? That's the challenge these numbers are screaming at us. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.